Hi, I'm Stuart Malina, Music Director of the Greenwich Symphony Orchestra. And today I'd like to have a short discussion of the music that we'll be performing in our opening concert on September 10th and 11th in Greenwich. It's my first concert as music director of the Greenwich Symphony Orchestra, and I've put together a program of 4 pieces that I truly think are wonderful and beautiful. If there's anything that ties this music together, in fact, it would be the lyricism of the music. But also, I think that there are jazz elements in each of them. And I'll talk just a little bit about that today. We begin with music of Leonard Bernstein that comes from the 1944 Broadway musical On the Town. On the Town came out of a ballet that Bernstein created with choreographer Jerome Robbins, which was called Fancy Free. And Fancy Free told the story of 3 sailors on shore leave in New York City. The decision was made to turn this into a full-fledged Broadway musical, and it was a hit on Broadway with lyrics and book written by Adolph Green and Betty Comden. Of course, the choreography was done by Jerome Robbins, and a wonderful score by Leonard Bernstein. Such was the success of the piece, and so much did Bernstein like the music, that he later decided to create a suite of dances for orchestra from the musical. These are 3 dances that were in the original On the Town, and he called this piece 3 dance episodes from On the Town, and it's in that form that we'll be performing this work of music. The first of 3 movements is called The Great Lover. And it comes from a section in the second act of On the Town, where it's a dream sequence, and the young woman is imagining the man that she's fallen in love with, Gaby, strolling through the streets of New York City as the great lover. The music is appropriately delightful and sparky, but I think that I'll start by talking a little bit about jazz in music. This is a jazzy piece of music, all 3 of these movements. And when I'm talking about that, I'm not saying that these are works of jazz. Jazz, in its essence, is about improvisation, and nothing you'll be hearing is improvised. It's all written out. But Bernstein uses jazz elements in the creation of his music, and there are melodic elements, and there are harmonic elements. And just to give you a short overview of what I'm talking about, when I talk about melodic jazz elements, I'm talking about the incorporation of blue notes into the scales. And so if we take a major scale as the building block of music, we can add 2 notes into it, which we call blue notes, which are notes in that scale that are flattened by 1/2 step. So instead of an E, we put an E flat. And instead of a B, we put a B flat. And so the scale becomes, when you incorporate the blue notes, already you can hear it's beginning to sound jazzy. Now, in terms of harmonic elements, I'm talking about chords, which are the building blocks of harmony in music, which incorporate the blue notes, or chords that incorporate what I call extensions of chords. In terms of chords that involve blue notes, I mean, the simplest would be from a C major chord, adding that flatted 7th, and we have what's called a dominant 7 chord. And then we can make other chords like that, out of that. And if we incorporate the flatted 3rd into this 7 chord, we have one of my favorite chords, which is called a sharp 9 chord, which includes both a major 3rd and a minor 3rd, giving you this very jazzy sound. When I'm talking about extensions in chords, I'm talking about going even further and taking these basic chords and adding notes onto them. So if you have as your chord a major chord, as I said before, you can add the 7th, then you could add a 9th, a 3rd above that. You can add a 3rd above that. You can add a 3rd above that. And so on. You have 9 chords, 11 chords, 13 chords. But the concept is taking basic chords and adding notes above them to create new and jazzy sounds. By the same token, you could take that same major chord and add the normal B natural in a C major scale, and you have what we call a major 7 chord, and then you can extend that to a major 9 chord, a major 11 chord, 13, etc., etc. So these are the building blocks that Bernstein is using. And I bring this up because right away, at the very beginning of this piece, he starts in the key of E major. And what it would sound like if it was just plain E major would be. But this opening chord incorporates all of these strange notes as well. So in the E major chord, we can add that G natural, and we can also add a major 7. And that's the chord that you'll hear at the beginning. So it's using dissonance in a way that creates a jazzy sound. And we get it right at the beginning of this piece. The other thing that you'll get in this opening movement is a little bit of a sense of swing. Swing is taking a straight rhythm and turning it into a triplet rhythm. Now we're doing it much quicker in this piece, but you'll hear what I'm talking about a little bit into this. So let me play a little bit of this opening, and I hope you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. So on and so forth. So yap-a-dap-a-dap, dap-a-dap-a-dap. That is a swing kind of feel. This accompaniment is called a stride. That comes out of the world of ragtime and the stride music that came directly after the ragtime era. And we have all these chords, not just at the beginning, but also when we change to C major, and then have that sharp 9 chord with both a B natural and a B flat. So essentially that's what Bernstein's doing, using jazz chords, jazz melodies to create this beautiful music. Now the second movement of the suite is called Lonely Town. It's a pas de deux. Gaby, again, one of the 3 sailors, is sad being alone in this town. And he sings a very beautiful song, and I guess I'll sing you a little bit of that. The town's a lonely town when you pass through, and there is no one waiting there for you. Then it's a lonely town. And he takes that melody and immediately after the song in the show creates this beautiful pas de deux. And the pas de deux begins with just the clarinet family setting it up in terms of the sound of what this movement will be. It's a little bit stark, extremely introverted, very warm. And this is what this sounds like. And then a trumpet, a muted trumpet, which immediately gives you a sense of jazziness, plays the Lonely Town theme. Now, not only is it a muted trumpet, which sounds jazzy, but also the melody sounds jazzy because of this flat note. That F natural is a blue note. And so he takes this opening and gradually expands it, almost like he's inhaling as it continues to go on, and it gets bigger and bigger until you have a soaring melody over a pulsating accompaniment in the lower strings and lower wind instruments. The last movement is extremely beautiful. It's a Times Square movement, Times Square, 1944. This is designed to create a sense of the hustle and bustle. This is the opening scene of On the Town, where the sailors have arrived and they sing the song, New York, New York. Let's see. The famous famous places, we visit oh so many, or so the guidebooks say. I promised, baby, I wouldn't miss on any, and we have just one day. And then it gets into, of course, the famous part of the song. New York, a visitor's place, where no one lives on account of the pace, but 7 million are screaming for space. New York, it's a visitor's place, and so on. So this New York theme becomes the basis of this whole final movement. It's the most extensive movement in the On the Town Dance episodes, beginning with that verse that I just sang for you, and going into the New York theme, and then taking it in all kinds of new directions, incorporating new instruments as well. You'll hear a saxophone in the orchestra, and that also is to evoke the sense of the jazz era, of jazz music. He'll also change the feels, the tempos of the New York theme. It's a wonderful tour de force of composition, a great piece of musical theater, and I think it kicks our concert off to a wonderful start. The second piece on our program is by Sergei Prokofiev, one of the last works that he wrote, his Symphony No. 7. It was written in 1952 after a long and very successful career, a career that actually had several different phases. In the earliest phase, when he was young, he was writing very angular, dissonant, exciting, wonderful, but difficult music. And then he kind of took a turn, and in this turn, he started writing some beautiful music for children, including, of course, the famous Peter and the Wolf, also a suite of piano pieces for children. And he also started writing ballet music. My two favorites of his ballet scores are Cinderella and Romeo and Juliet. And in this phase, he was writing extremely lyrical, expansive, humorous, spectacular music, if you ask me. And so by the time he reached 1952, after living under the Stalinist government for a long time and going through some unbelievable trials and tribulations, including the arrest of his wife on charges of treason, he was asked by one of the radio stations to write a piece for a broadcast for children. And so in 1952, he produced the Seventh Symphony. Now, this is not really a work of children's music in the way that Peter and the Wolf is. Rather, it's a very sophisticated and magnificent work of great music that happens to also have great appeal for young audiences. Because of its lyricism, because of its excitement, because of its humor. It's a piece that really has two sides to it. In a sense, it's a reminiscence of childhood by an old man. And so you have kind of a picture of an older person set out at the very beginning, and then you can almost hear in the music him looking back and hearing episodes of his life, going all the way back to young childhood, to episodes of love. But he always brings back this motive of the ticking clock. And you actually almost literally hear a ticking clock ticking away the rest of his life. So it's a bittersweet piece. It's an ambiguous piece. But as I say, it's so beautifully lyrical, so wonderfully constructed, and so engaging. I think it's one of his greatest works. So let me take you through the four movements of this piece briefly. It begins, as I said, starkly. Not just starkly in terms of the mood. It's in C sharp minor, so it's already a very dark key, a very sad melody that we begin with. But also it's stark in the way it's constructed, in that it's just a melody and a bass line. No harmony in between, but rather implied harmony through these two lines that are interplaying. And this is what it sounds like. And this continues for a while. and then starts building in excitement. And suddenly things are moving and the harmonies are shifting very quickly. This is something that Prokofiev is kind of famous for, is the way that he manipulates harmony, going from one key to another in incredibly fast succession. It builds in excitement, it builds in energy, and then it relaxes into a second theme, which is extremely lush. So this is the other side of the coin. You have old age and the old man looking back, and then you have this vision of a beautiful summer day or of young love, or however you wish to describe it. But this is what that theme sounds like. Etc. This theme will turn very quickly into the ticking clock theme that I talked about earlier. And let me play just a little bit of that for you. So those two themes are going to be the bookends for this piece. These themes will come back at the last movement. We call this a cyclical symphony, where material from the early movements is brought back in later movements to create a unified piece of music. But in this piece, I think it also has a real more meaning in a very literal sense. Again, he's had this entire vision of youth that's going to be the bulk of this piece, but it always comes back to the reality of this old man and the precious time that we have on earth. So the second movement of the symphony is a waltz. Prokofiev was no stranger to writing dance music, certainly no stranger to writing waltzes. For Cinderella, his ballet, he wrote several waltzes just for that one ballet. There are waltzes as well in Romeo and Juliet and in every other ballet that he wrote. And so he really was kind of a master of creating beautiful and lyrical waltzes. This one is extremely lovely. It begins kind of in an understated way, with a little bit under tempo and very graceful and delightful. And then suddenly things pick up. Suddenly into a very different, much faster, jolly waltz, which takes similar material from the very beginning and creates a very beautiful waltz melody. And this will take us through all kinds of beautiful sections. Again, he'll be shifting keys in a very quick way, shifting tonalities. His orchestration will move from instrument to instrument. Sometimes the lower instruments will play the melody and the upper will accompany. This is all very typical fare for Prokofiev. About midway through this movement, though, we'll get a very different kind of waltz theme. This one has a little bit more of almost a jazzy feel. I hesitate to say it, but it is in fact based on a major 7 chord, which I think of as a kind of a American musical song, the American songbook kind of sound, and a little bit jazzy. And this is what this melody will sound like. Another typical sound for Prokofiev. It's kind of commonly known as Prokofiev using wrong notes. And he'll throw in these very dissonant notes that don't always sound aggressive and angry. Sometimes they just sound funny, as I think in this particular case. So this waltz will go on. It will build in energy. It will have peaks. It'll have valleys. But it has a very exciting and dazzling finish as things pick up and the orchestration gets thicker to bring us to a very exciting and crashing finish. The third movement is very simple. It's the shortest of the movements. And I like thinking of it as just kind of a lyrical song. It starts with a very beautiful melody, which begins in the cello. But it doesn't stay in the cello. Throughout this movement, he's going to be handing this melody from instrument to instrument. So this melody that begins in the cello will hand off to the first violins, which will then hand off to the clarinets, which will then hand off to the English horn, and then to the lower strings that will take the melody. Let me play a little bit of it for you so you can get a sense of what this movement sounds like. And so on. And he'll take this very simple melody and through the use of what I was talking about before, handing it off from instruments in different ranges, and also through different orchestrations, sometimes bringing accompaniments in the harp and the piano in the orchestra, creating kind of an ethereal feeling, and sometimes a little bit more soaring in terms of the way that the melody is presented. But it creates variation in this very simple theme, which dominates the movement. There is one other section of the piece, which again, at one point has elements of, again, the clicking, the ticking clock coming back into play. But it's a secondary melody that you'll hear originally in the oboe. And the second time the oboe plays it, it's joined by the xylophone, as well as the strings playing pizzicato, plunking the strings. I'll try to approximate it on the piano, but this is what it sounds like. So forth. So the third movement then comes back to the original expressive melody and brings it to a very calm close. And this sets up beautifully the explosion of the last movement. And it really does begin kind of in a frenzy with the strings playing in unison, a very fast, very frenetic theme. And this sets up a delightful, funny, jolly melody in the strings. And so forth. I can't play it well enough on the piano to make it sound right. But here too, he takes you through all kinds of harmonic adventures with this very simple, very jolly, very funny melody that the fourth movement is comprised of. At one point in the middle, though, he changes his feeling entirely, and after a short interlude, takes you into a quirky march. Again, this is not unheard of for the music of Prokofiev. There are very famous marches in all of his ballets, a very famous one in The Love of Three Oranges, his opera, as well as in Romeo and Juliet and in Cinderella. But here, in the middle of this very jolly movement, we get a quirky, very Prokofiev-sounding march. So forth. It's just kind of a contrast to the jolly march, the jolly polka dance that we had earlier on in the movement. And when I say it's a typical Prokofiev melody, the most obvious element that makes it sound like Prokofiev is, again, these dissonant notes that he throws into the melody. Begins, well, it is kind of a blue note, this D sharp or E flat and a C major chord. And again, that kind of dissonant C sharp, this time against a G chord. And so on. I just explain that because these are elements that people talk about when you're listening to music of Prokofiev and you hear these strange notes. This is kind of part of his vocabulary as a composer, to create melodies that have interest to them. It's never exactly what you're expecting. He'll throw in these little twists and strange notes that keep you always on your toes listening. So after a long foray through these two sections, the light polka dance and then the march, he has a huge triumphant return to the beautiful melody from the first movement. And you're thinking that this is going to wind this piece together in a very beautiful way. But instead, he then returns once again to the ticking clock. And in fact, it's the ticking clock that gets the final word in this piece. He ends it on a quiet tone with a C sharp major chord and this ticking clock. In the bell-like instruments, and it just kind of winds away and dies extremely beautifully, but certainly not in a celebratory way. Now, there's an interesting side story to this, which is that Prokofiev wanted to submit this for a competition that he was hoping he would win, and he thought that he would have a better chance if he wrote a lively ending with a bang. And so he did actually create an alternate ending for this piece. But after hearing a performance of it, he asked the conductor and several of his friends to ensure that it would never, ever be performed again. Now, that didn't come true necessarily. There are recordings that include this big, powerful ending. But we will honor Prokofiev's desires in this performance and end the piece in the quiet, serene way that he originally intended. The second half of our program begins with the beautiful poem for orchestra by William Grant Still. William Grant Still was a great American composer, an African-American composer, and until very recently was really the only African-American composer whose music was being played after his death. He was a conductor, he was a composer, he was an arranger. He was really a very important figure in American music, and his music, which is only now to a certain degree being rediscovered, is extraordinary. It's music of great lyricism, but also of great emotional power. And William Grant Still, like Leonard Bernstein, incorporated a lot of jazz elements into his music. And so in this poem for orchestra, you're going to hear a lot of the same kinds of techniques, using melodies that might have blue notes, certainly lush harmonies that come out of the world of jazz and the Great American Songbook. The other thing that you should know about the poem for orchestra, which was written in 1944, obviously a dark time for the world, is that it's a piece that really describes emerging from a dark world into a world of hope and joy and love. And so the first half of the piece is extremely dark, extremely stormy, extremely complex in its harmonic and melodic structure and content. And then the second half of the piece is truly like the clouds part, a bright sun starts shining through, and you hear lush melodies with rich harmonies. He really pulls this off beautifully. At the very beginning of the piece, he uses, I talked a little bit before about extensions of chords. William Grant Still goes a step further by actually combining chords on top of each other. So at the very beginning, you have a C sharp minor chord on top and a B flat major chord on the bottom, creating this kind of a harmony. Now that does sound jazzy because it has the C sharp and the B natural, the D natural on top of a B flat. You get kind of that sense again of the sharp 9 chord that I talked about earlier in talking about jazz chords. But here it's actually extremely dissonant and yet somehow entrancing. And on top of this, we have a stormy theme in the woodwinds. And this creates this world of murkiness, of darkness, of intensity, of angst. And that permeates the entire first half of this 11 or 12 minute piece. It will build in its energy, it will build in its intensity, and it will build in its orchestration. And we will reach a section which almost sounds like a fanfare. And in this fanfare section, he's going to take us through several chords, building an energy. So let me find it for you. So we begin in F on top of G flat, and then we have what's called an F7 flat 9 chord, and then we get to G7. Suddenly the clouds are beginning to open, and then E major, and he stays in E major. And then we're in the world of light, the world of hope, and he plays a beautiful, very American song. It's such a special moment in this piece where suddenly from the entire orchestra playing these huge fanfares, taking us out of the darkness into the light, and then suddenly it's just the strings and a harp playing in very luscious textures this beautiful melody. I'll say one more thing about this piece, and that's at the very end, After this beautiful light section, he does end on somewhat of a question mark. It's not a statement like we are now in the light, but rather there are still challenges. And he does this in the final measure. We have this A major 7 chord, a very bright, beautiful, warm chord, and then suddenly he changes and ends on a minor chord with that same major 7. So maybe not, all is not quite so well with the world in 1944. I think it's a wonderful piece for our time. It's a time when we need hope and we need to think about emerging from the many darknesses that we face on a daily basis. The final piece on our program, in a sense, really doesn't need any introduction. It's one of the most popular pieces in the repertoire. It's Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. The story of its writing is one of the great stories where Gershwin got a call asking him to write a piece for a big concert that was going to happen in 1924, which was going to be a concert combining the worlds of jazz with the worlds of classical music. Would you write a piece for this? And Gershwin said, no, I can't. I'm too busy. I'm doing my Broadway shows. I've got too much on my plate. I'm sorry, I can't. So he goes off to Paris, has a wonderful time in Paris. And as he's returning from Paris, he sees in the newspaper an announcement of this concert at Aeolian Hall, announcing that there would be on the program a new piano concerto by George Gershwin. And so I guess his hand was tied, he had no choice, and he wrote this unbelievably brilliant piece called Rhapsody in Blue. So what is the idea behind Rhapsody in Blue? Well, of course, it's an incorporation of jazz idiom into classical music. It is a piano concerto, a piece for piano solo and orchestra. Originally, it was written for a jazz orchestra, by the way, the Paul Whiteman Band. The version that we'll be doing was a later orchestration by Ferd Groffet for a full symphony orchestra, and it's the version that you hear most often in the concert hall. But I think Rhapsody in Blue is best understood as what it's called, a rhapsody. It's a piece that doesn't have any real form to it. It's almost like a stream of consciousness, a dream that takes you from one world into another and presents you with different musical material, and then plays around with it and brings it back and then brings back something else, and then you move on to something new. And it's episodic in that Leonard Bernstein was famous for saying that you could actually rearrange the piece and it wouldn't lose anything. You could cut out any section and it would still be Rhapsody in Blue. But the one thing that is undeniable about this piece is that it was unique, it was brash, it was forward-looking, and really showed this new superstar of composition, George Gershwin. Up to this point, he was really known as a songwriter, and in fact, to this day, I think he might be the greatest of all of the American songwriters. But for him to have written this masterpiece on a much greater scale kind of set the stage for some of his later works that he would write before his untimely death, before the age of 40. So iconically, the piece begins with a clarinet glissando. And a glissando, normally you think about in a trombone, boom, which is, taking two notes and playing every note in between, but not as individual notes, but as one long slide between the two. You can't do it on a piano because there's no way to play the in-between sounds. But on a trombone you can, but at the beginning of Rhapsody in Blue, it's done on a clarinet. And I'm not going to begin to approximate on the piano what it sounds like, but what it will sound like is somewhat like, and you'll be in the famous melody. And of course, everyone recognizes that. The piano enters after this introduction with kind of a statement, a beautiful, warm solo. And and then the whole orchestra will play that opening theme before it moves on into the next episode. You're going to hear lots of other wonderful melodies, including and so on and so forth. One thing that all of these melodies have in common is the use of these blue tones that we talked about before, the flat 7 and the flat 3rd. So here is the 7. And you'll get that throughout all of the different melodies. Of course, the most famous melody of all comes about 2/3 of the way through the piece. And it's the famous United Airlines theme, I hate to say, but most people know it as this. And I suppose there is some benefit to that it's part of our consciousness, although I hate the thought that when you hear Rhapsody in Blue, you think about planes taking off, but for what it's worth. So yes, it's a beautiful melody. It definitely has jazz elements in it as well, with that moving part in the middle of those long tones. But more than anything, it's just absolutely beautiful music. The last part of this piece I'll talk about before ending this discussion is the toccata. A toccata is a section of music that's technical and generally very fast. This is an extended piano solo in this particular piece. And when you hear it very fast, it's hard to know what the elements of this toccata are. It's actually a rhythmic figure based around da 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 da, that pulsating, syncopated rhythm. And to fill in the blanks in the pulses, he gives you this. But of course, when it's very fast, it all becomes just kind of a blur. And so on and so forth. So that's our concert in a nutshell. Of course, there's much more we could have talked about. But this probably is longer than it should be anyway. I hope you've listened. I hope you've enjoyed it. And more than anything, I hope you'll join us at the Performing Arts Center at Greenwich High School on September 10th at 7:30, September 11th at 3 o'clock. That's Saturday and Sunday. And I hope you'll enjoy this concert by this wonderful orchestra in my inaugural concert as music director. See you there.